Good evening and welcome to this meeting of the Republican Labour Education Forum. The topic this evening is an extremely serious one, the war on Lebanon and Iran. Therefore, we are very fortunate to have two outside speakers who are experts on the Middle East, Yassamine Mather and Tony Greenstein. However, before we start the meeting, since this is October the 7th and therefore the anniversary of the incursion by Hamas into Israel to capture hostages, we are going to take a minute's silence to remember all those who've died on October the 7th and in the ensuing and continuing genocide in Gaza, and indeed all the people who have died since 1948 in the occupied state of Palestine. Thank you for observing that minute's silence. Yassamine Mather is going to start the meeting. Yassamine is an Iranian academic who is the acting editor of the academic journal Critique and a regular contributor to The Weekly Worker. She works in the Middle East Centre of the University of Oxford. So over to you, Yassamine. Yeah, over to you, Yassamine, to start off our meeting.
Into a war against Lebanon and against Iran. And in some ways, we can argue that the failure to achieve what Netanyahu claimed, i.e., destroying Hamas completely in Gaza, although they have inflicted inevitably a lot of damage to Hamas, but the failure to destroy Hamas and the pressures internally in Israel in terms of finding a deal regarding hostages has meant that Netanyahu, looking maybe at a Trump victory in November in the US, has decided to turn this war into a war against, first of all, Lebanon, and this was seen by what I have called in a number of articles mass mutilation of Lebanese citizens, because they're not just Hezbollahis, they're also Lebanese citizens, very often relatives, but also at times nothing to do with Hezbollah. And then the assassination of Nasrallah, who was not just Hezbollah's leader, he was a Lebanese politician. You should see the eulogies that Maronite leaders have written about him. If you haven't, go to Newsweek and see what Aoun and Frangier have written about Nasrallah. So he was a senior Lebanese politician, to do very much with the way Hezbollah had evolved over the years from a militia organization in South Lebanon into a major political force and an economic force in Lebanon, with supporters in every echelons of society, but also in the higher echelons of Lebanese capital. So that in itself was quite serious. Then last Monday, maybe not as important for Western audiences, but very important for Iranian audiences, we had this rather racist stupid address by Netanyahu. He addressed the Iranian people, telling them that they deserve better than the Islamic Republic. As someone who's always fought the Islamic Republic, I don't disagree on the first part of it. The problem is in the second part, the kind of regime change Netanyahu has in mind will make the mess in Libya, the terrible situation in Syria, the mess in Iraq and Afghanistan look like very nice resolutions to regime change from above. So, and I think here he's either deluded, but he's also under the influence of fascist, semi-fascist right-wing Iranians, supporters of the monarchy, who've been in exile for more than 44 years and who have no idea what Iran is like these days. And they've told him, oh, every Iranian hates the regime. It's true that a very large proportion of the younger population in Iran don't like the regime. It is a neoliberal economic power. It has privatized a lot of things. And it also interferes in the private lives of individuals. However, I can assure Netanyahu and the US that if there was a single attack on Iran, good or bad, irrespective of what you think, and I'm never supporter of nationalism, but Persian nationalism would make such victory very difficult. So he's deluded, and that address angered Iran. It was definitely an attempt to anger Iran. Pezeshkian, Iran's new president, a week before in New York, was right to say that Israel keeps trying to trapping us into a war. They first killed Haniyeh in Tehran during his visit for the presidential inauguration. Then they've done this attack on civilians in Lebanon. Then they've killed Nasrallah. And he was right. There is a trap. The problem is that that trap has some benefits for Netanyahu, as I said, because he responds to the issue of not responding to ceasefire, not doing a deal regarding hostages, failure to win in Gaza by diverting attention. So the question that is on everyone's mind this week, and news agencies have been going on about it since Tuesday, Iran's attack on Israel, is would there be a war with Iran? I think Iran had no choice but to retaliate. It was losing face. People in the region who do have, in my opinion, illusions about the axis of resistance were becoming dissatisfied with Iran's what people called calibrated opposition to genocide in Gaza. Calibrated in that throughout this year, Iran has retaliated in very small, measured ways, but it has also been a restraining force. And I think both US and the European Union realize that Iran has restrained its allies. And very often, these allies aren't just proxies of Iran, they have a life of their own. And because they have a life of their own, they don't necessarily obey everything that Iran says. That's true of the Houthis, that's definitely true of Hezbollah. They have their own national ambitions in terms of Hezbollah to become more of a government power in Lebanon, in terms of the Houthis of controlling all of Yemen and becoming the power in Yemen. So I think we should be very skeptical about the kind of publicity put forward by Western media that these are just proxies. I'm not saying Iran has no relation with these people, but they're not just proxies of Iran. But wherever Iran had a role, it was one of restraining these people, of calibrating their responses. And all of that broke, I think, first with the pager attack in Lebanon, then with the killing of Nasrallah, who was and remains very important for Iran's leadership. The question now is, would there be a war with Iran? And the press and the media the Middle Eastern press and media last Wednesday and Thursday were saying, Khamenei is going to Friday prayers and Israel is going to assassinate him. And then the more deluded sections of Western media were saying, oh, he's in a bunker, he's never going to go to the prayers. He did go to the Friday prayers. He gave a reasonably long speech, and he addressed, interestingly, in Arabic, the Arab street. And in this, he was very clear. He was addressing the Arab street because he knows there is dissatisfaction with the current governments in most of these countries, in Egypt, in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia. They admitted, these governments all admitted. And so he was addressing these people in opposition to the Netanyahu talk, which was, as I said, very racist, because he was trying to say that Iranians and the Jewish people somehow unite against Arabs. It was an Islamophobic talk, but also one that addressed Iranians and the people currently living Zionists rather than the Jewish people. The Zionists, he will unite Iranians and Zionists. And so it was, I thought, as much as I dislike Iran's supreme leader, it was a clever speech. You can admit that your enemy is clever when he is being clever. The question of whether there will be a major war between Iran and Israel depends very much on how Israel retaliates. Now, on the one hand, Biden, Starmer are clearly supporting Netanyahu's efforts, both in Lebanon and his ambition to attack Iran. But on the other hand, they have fears. They have fears about even the bombing of oil installations, because bombing Iran's oil installations will have an effect. The UK, US, Europe, and because of sanctions, don't buy Iranian oil. The price of the oil will go up, there is no doubt. And therefore, it could trigger an economic crisis. Even the, if you like, the rumor that Iran might be attacked in its oil installations made sure that the price of oil increased by 5%. So you can imagine that if in reality this attack took place, that would be an issue. Then there is the second option, which is to attack Iran's oil refineries, not installations. And of course, that would have an effect in terms of price of oil going up inside the country, but it will not have an effect internationally. Israel is obviously clearly looking at bombing the Air Force bases where the ballistic missiles that went to Israel, and in my opinion, quite a few of them did go through the Iron Dome. My understanding is that one landed near Mossad's offices. From CNN's stupid report, I can gather that one of them did get to an airbase. So at least 24 of them did get through. So the Iron Dome, and the dome is supposed to be perfect. If it's not perfect, if it has got holes, it's no longer an Iron Dome. So the Iron Dome was damaged, in my opinion, and more importantly, Israel's reputation was damaged in that attack. So they might go for attacking those air bases. They also apparently are still considering going for the nuclear installations. Now, I don't think on its own Israel can bomb the bunkers that holds Iran's nuclear advances in terms of uranium enrichment. They will need US support, and at this stage, the Biden administration isn't giving a green light on that. But they could attack the other, if you like, the overground installations, and that would imply a major retaliation by Iran. Iran would need to retaliate by using more ballistic missiles. So the 3-4 scenarios that can happen might lead to a war with Iran. If it's a very limited attack, for example, if it's just the air bases, given that Iran has moved the ballistic missiles over the last week from those air bases, then the retaliation by Iran might be more limited. Clearly, the US and the EU are doing their best to give false promises, as they did throughout summer and early autumn, to Iran, that if you keep restraining yourself, you will be compensated with a better nuclear deal, with better economic deal. I think the Iranians have come to a stage, the Iranian government has come to a stage when they no longer believe this. And then we have the whole issue of the Israeli government itself. Clearly, it did face rebellion, opposition. It was facing mass demonstrations, a nationwide strike about avoiding a hostage deal or a ceasefire. And the invasion of Lebanon is very popular. Now, again, the numbers are amazing. I keep having to look at it in terms of numbers. So 1,200, if I'm not wrong, were killed on the 7th of October. The numbers I have is 42,000 Palestinians killed in Gaza. And that's not including those who we don't know, who are under the rubble. It does not include those who are dying because of hunger. And it does not include those who are dying because they are not getting basic medical services. I think Lancet put it at over 180,000. That's probably still a conservative figure. So 1,200, maybe 180,000. And again, in terms of Lebanon and the southern, the northern borders of Israel, southern borders of Lebanon, in northern Israel, we are told 60,000 people have been moved. They have been forced to leave their home over the year because of the attacks, missile attacks by Hezbollah. My understanding is that at least 1,200,000 Lebanese people from South Lebanon have been forced to move away from South Lebanon. So again, the numbers are amazing. But the Lebanon war is popular in Israel, there is no doubt. And so for Netanyahu, it hasn't been a bad tactic so far. Of course, if Hezbollah keeps continuing fighting, if Hezbollah is not weakened as Netanyahu assumed it would be just because its leadership, and not just Nasrallah, have been assassinated, then that might not be a long-term victory for Netanyahu. And what I think the other positive point for Netanyahu is that not just the Republicans in US, but even sections of what I would call liberal bourgeois press, media, governments are so anti-Iran that the invasion of Lebanon has been popular with them, and therefore it has reduced pressure on Netanyahu. Read the statements on Biden about Nasrallah. He's saying it was a good job. The problem with both Netanyahu and his allies is their failure to understand Shia Islam. I was brought up as a Shia, although my family weren't very religious, but I was in a country, even under the Shah, that was a Shia government. They thrive in martyrdom. We learn from a young age that the best thing that can happen is what happened to Imam Hussein in Karbala. He was killed by the Sunnis, and then thousands replaced him. And I think Hezbollah is in a very similar situation. The Iraqi Shias have proved they are in a similar situation. And so this ignorance of martyrdom, the role of martyrdom in Shia Islam might not be a very clever thing for Netanyahu and his allies. In terms of global outlook on Israel, I think it is seen as a settler colonial state. It is now seen by many people, students I meet on campus here in Oxford, as the representation of everything that was terrible about colonialism. There they were, these people were told, you are in the post-colonial era, we are in the, there's no more racism, there's no more colonialism. And here they are facing this unbelievable genocide in Gaza. And what the authorities, including in my university, but also globally in terms of the liberal bourgeoisie, don't seem to understand is the fact that everything has changed. In the words of Hamid Dabashi, everything has changed since 9th of October. And how has it changed? Well, first of all, people are questioning the whole concept that colonialism is finished. Of course it isn't. If what we are seeing is the result of 1948, is the result of Nakba, if you're looking at settler colonialism. So we can't say we are in a post-colonial era. Racism. Well, here we are in academic institutions, in public institutions, in ministries, in offices, in journalism, where people of color, people of minorities, religious, national minorities, have been, in my opinion, at times artificially promoted to give this appearance that we are over the era of racism. And here they are, they're facing the fact that unless they're stupid enough as Suella Braverman or Priti Patel to support Israel, then they're facing very serious consequences when they try and raise issues about colonialism. They do look at how the press, the media, their government deals with one person dying in Ukraine as opposed to tens of thousands dying in Gaza. And I think that is a factor that has changed people's opinions about everything, especially the young. And if you like, in the words of Avi Schlein, some people are on the wrong side of history and they haven't woken up to the fact that they are in the wrong side of history, while the student occupiers, the protesters, the ones who go to demonstrations for Gaza, they're on the right side of history. The Zionist policies of this Netanyahu regime are certainly turning Israel into an extremist right-wing state. I don't use the word fascist generally because I think we have to be very careful of using the term fascist. If you use it about everyone, then it loses its original meaning. But it definitely is true that the current Israeli state is an extremely right-wing government. It is supported by extremely right-wing forces. In fact, for example, the Iranian royalists who support Netanyahu were actually supporters of Reza Pahlavi, the ex-Shah's father, who was a fascist. He did support Hitler. The same could be true of a number of US Republicans who support the Zionist state, and they're all of the extreme right. So I think we should put Israel in that scenario. And finally, on what we can do. It's very difficult because obviously I think a large proportion of the British public, never mind the left, has now taken a very strong position on Palestine. They are committed to the demonstrations. You see a variety of British society in every time you go to these demonstrations. But these mobilizations, I think, have to become more, have to have more serious directions. I don't think it's sufficient to just say that we are in favor of the defeat of, we are in favor of the Palestinian people. We have to say it's not enough to call for a ceasefire. I think we do need more radical slogans. The British government is supporting, despite the temporary freezing of sending arms to Israel, the British government is an ally of the US, and we have to call on the British state, we have to oppose the British state's support for Zionism, the US support for Zionism, but also instead of, in my opinion, instead of calling for victory to Hezbollah or Hamas, we should call for victory for the Palestinians and the Arab peoples of the region and the Hebrew population of the region. And here I think there are clearly demands for supporting the protests in the Arab countries that are challenging these dictatorships. It's repression that is stopping mass solidarity in Egypt and Jordan in particular, amongst other countries, with the Palestinian people. That mass movement can overthrow these dictatorships. So we should aim towards that. And of course, we have to call for boycott. BDS is important. It's a powerful tool in our hands. We should call for workers to take on these slogans. Trade unions shouldn't be isolated or economist when it comes to a situation of war that includes the British government. And if I could have joined Stop the War Coalition, because as an individual, I'm a member, but as an organization, Hands Off People of Iran was not allowed to join Stop the War, I would call for a much more radical position in terms of defending the protests of the working class in the Middle East, including Iran, in the fight against imperialism. And in that way, it is possible to gain a lot more support in the countries of the Middle East for Stop the War Coalition. That's all I have to say. Thank you. I hope I didn't talk too much.
No, thank you very much indeed, Yasmin. That was amazing. Thank you so much for your contribution. Yes, the working class. I think this is something that we've discussed ourselves. What role the working class should be playing, not only in Israel But Iran, all those Arab states, we look to the working class to rise up and take matters into their own hands and sort out the situation. It would be marvelous if that could happen. I'm going now straight to Tony Greenstein. We will be having a question and answer session. I know, Yasmin, that you are very, very busy, but if you can stay, we would really appreciate it, but we understand if you can't. Okay, thank you very much. So, Tony, over to you.
I think the first point I want to say is that after October the 7th, nothing will be the same. Zionism in the form of Netanyahu and the government coalition, but we shouldn't just see it as the government coalition, because the far right really has 3/4 at least of representation in the Knesset. And indeed, today, I mean, it is a meaningless exercise to differentiate between left and right Zionists. For instance, the new leader of the combined Meretz and Israeli Labour parties, Yair Golan, who was deputy chief of staff, is enthusiastic about the war in Lebanon, for example. I mean, that derives from the old position of MAPAM, the United Workers' Party in Israel, which was often an extremely militarist party. And indeed, the first settlers, the Greater Israel movement, had amongst its founders some of the leaders of Ahdut Avodah, which again was a militaristic Zionist part of the overall Israeli labor movement. People like Yitzhak Tebenkin, Yisrael Galili, Yigal Alon, and so on. So it's a great mistake to see Zionism in terms of left and right. There are differences, there are tactical differences, not least within the right, but there is no principled disagreement. And the main bond that unites them is the belief in the Jewish supremacist state. Where they differ sometimes is on tactics, nothing more. But as I said, after October the 7th, nothing will be the same. And we see in the West that what we've had is a shredding of international law. The International Court of Justice issued a ruling that Israel shouldn't enter Rafah. And of course, you'll remember that Joe Biden said that that would be a red line, but like all the red lines, it disappeared the moment that Netanyahu disregarded his advice, as it were. So Israel is embarked in Gaza in a project of ethnic cleansing, if you like, the fulfillment of what happened in the Nakba, which was the expulsion of 750,000 refugees. And now they're aiming to complete that, not only in Gaza, but the war, in essence, for ethnic cleansing has started in the West Bank as well. And we saw a few days ago the Israeli aircraft bombing Tulkarm, the refugee camp, and something like 20 Palestinians died there. So there is a resistance growing up in the West Bank, as well as, of course, in Gaza. And in Gaza, if the aim is ethnic cleansing and the complete immiseration of the people there, then the question is whether they will succeed or not. And it is very clear that Israel has not yet been able to defeat Hamas militarily. And I suspect that if it can't defeat Hamas, which is a much weaker force, then it's not going to be successful in its ground invasion of Lebanon, where it has suffered a serious defeat in 2006, and indeed between 1982 and 2000, when it was forced to pull out. It's, I say, yet to be seen, because of course Hezbollah, which immediately opened a second front when Israel went into Lebanon. But in my view, it was a mistake to have confined their retaliation to northern Israel, because of course although there are 60,000 Israelis who've been displaced, 6,000 is 1% of the Israeli population. It is not a significant number. I think the lesson to be learned is, and Hezbollah, I hope, will have learned it, is that you can't poke a tiger. You either go in for the kill. You actually go from the start with a strategy aimed at overwhelming your enemy. And certainly Hezbollah had the means, if not to defeat Israel, to certainly inflict a very serious damage, if not a defeat of it. It paid the price. Israel has planned its war against Lebanon, not simply from October the 7th, but as we know, with the pager attack, that was 2 or 3 years in the making. But in essence, from 2006, when it suffered that defeat, the first defeat against any Arab army or a military formation, it has been planning its response, because for Zionism, it's inconceivable that you can have an Arab enemy, especially on your borders, that you have to live in fear of. So Zionism, which has Lebensraum, the idea of living space, the dynamic of expansion which is contained within it, that is incompatible with having a strong Arab force on its borders. And so a war with Hezbollah was always bound to occur. The question was when it would occur. And unfortunately, the timing of that was left to Israel rather than Hezbollah taking the initiative. Certainly Hamas and Hezbollah, as Yasmin said, are in a sense Iranian proxies and part of this axis of resistance, but they have their own interests, and Hamas did not inform Iran, and I suspect Hezbollah either, of what it was going to do when it launched its attack on October the 7th. Whether it was wise to do so is a question that Palestinians will no doubt debate in the future, but the fact is that it did attack on October the 7th, and there has been a year-long war as a result of it. A war, incidentally, which, although it is not terribly popular now, someone said 53% of the Israeli population are in favor of ending the war, and I don't know how accurate that is, but it was in Haaretz. At the beginning of the war with Hamas, the attack on Hamas in Gaza, 95% of the Israeli population supported that war. So I suspect, although the attack on Hezbollah and South Lebanon is popular at the moment, as the casualties mount and the Israeli army becomes embroiled in the ground offensive, it will become less and less popular. That was incidentally the case in 1982, which was also initially a popular war, but as it dragged on and the casualties mounted, so the opposition in Israel itself also mounted. But I think one thing is very clear. Netanyahu depends in his governing coalition on the support of the far right, which are really neo-Nazis, Itamar Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and the others. People are really off the wall. I mean, they actually make people like Marine Le Pen seem on the left. I mean, they are really genocidalists. They are racial supremacists. They are quite open that they would desire to wipe the Palestinians off the earth if they could. Anyone who saw the podcast recently by two nice Jewish boys discussing how if they had the chance to press a button and erase every single Palestinian in Gaza and the West Bank, they would do so. And they added this an afterthought. Well, this is what most people think, and it's true. There is an exterminationist mentality in Israel as regards to Palestinians and any other Arab opponents. And if they could, they would indeed do it. But as Smotrich said recently, it would be the most moral thing in the world to starve 2 million Gazans. Unfortunately, the world won't let us, and to some extent that is true. But as we also know, Israel has been doing its best to starve the Palestinian people in Gaza. And it's been doing that with American support. There are recent revelations that Antony Blinken, although calling for more aid lorries, was at the same time supporting Israel, bombing those aid lorries on the ground, of course, that they were really Hamas supplies, and therefore they were a valid military target because, again, in Israel, in Gaza, every single hospital, every single school, every single university has been attacked to some extent or another. I mean, people often say, "Oh, you mustn't compare this to the Nazis," but you may not know. But the Jewish hospital in Berlin survived until the end of the war untouched. And that was in the heart of the Nazi Empire. So it is a contrast. Israel razed to the ground Al Shifa, the main hospital, on a variety of pretexts. It was a Hamas command and control center and so on. Sorry. So, I mean, the Israeli state is utterly ruthless. And we've seen the comparisons, for example, between October the 7th and the Holocaust. This was the greatest loss of Jewish people since the Holocaust, but it's not true anyway. 3 times as many died under the Argentine junta. But also, of course, it's irrelevant. The Nazis killed Jews because they were Jews. Hamas killed Israelis not because they were Jewish, but because they were occupiers. There's a complete world of difference, but Zionism, of course, conflates everything into anti-Semitism because that's really its only method of survival. The question of Iran, I mean, I've described it as a paper tiger in many ways. Iran would love to come to terms with US imperialism in the same way it's reached agreements with the Saudi regime, for example. But of course, imperialism is not prepared to do so, and in particular, the Israeli state, whose aim is to become the main hegemonic power in the Middle East. And therefore, it's absolutely unacceptable that Iran challenges it. It's got very little to do with its nuclear capabilities and so on. It's to do with the fact that Israel wishes to rule or dominate the Middle East unchallenged. And although the United States, to some extent, would be prepared to allow Iran some role, for example, Obama concluded the nuclear agreement with them, which Trump tore up and Biden hasn't reinstated. Israel is quite clear. I mean, its own interests dictate that it will be unchallenged in the Middle East. And that is what lies at the heart of the attack on Iran. Has, of course, nothing to do with the nature of the Iranian regime. Israel is quite happy to have relations with the Egyptian regime, which is probably the most repressive in the Middle East, the Saudi regime, the Gulf sheikdoms, and so on. As regards Hezbollah, it's clear that they have suffered a major setback with the pager attack, which was a long time in preparation, and then the assassination of Nasrallah and virtually the whole of Hezbollah leadership. But whether that will transform itself into a disadvantage on the battlefield, we simply do not know. We simply do not know, for example, the extent of the capability in terms of missiles that Hezbollah has and its ability to coordinate attacks on Israel. I suspect it still has the majority capability that it had, even if it's going to find it very difficult to coordinate those attacks. But as I said before, the key question is going to be whether Israel can sustain a ground war. My own view is it will find extreme difficulty because Hezbollah knows that territory. The Israeli military do not, and they've already suffered significant casualties. But it's not something I can really speculate on. It's something that will turn on events themselves. But Israel is also likely to be suffering from hubris and overconfidence as a result of the pager attacks and the elimination of the Hezbollah leadership. Where do we go now? I think what has been marked in the conflict, which has erupted and taken place in the last year, is the complete refusal of the Arab regimes to do anything which might prevent Israel doing what it's done, its genocidal wars. I mean, these regimes are absolutely shameless, they're corrupt, they're repressive, they lack a popular base, and they rely, in essence, on coercion, nothing more. And they're integrated to a greater or lesser extent in the trading relationships and the financial regimes that now percolate throughout the Middle East. So the key element and the key question is whether the Arab masses will be able to overthrow those regimes, as nearly happened in the Arab Spring. And that's not something, again, one can predict from here. I mean, the Houthi regime, although repressive internally and very reactionary in many ways, has stood out for its attacks on shipping in the Red Sea, and clearly Iran is in a position to do much the same with the Straits of Hormuz. Whether it does so, whether in fact it was to attack Saudi and other oil fields, it's quite capable of doing, is an open question. I mean, Yassamine mentioned, of course, the repressive nature of the Iranian regime. And there is no doubt it is an extremely repressive regime in many ways. I mean, it has, I think, the third highest rate of death implementation of the death penalty in the world. It's not a pretty regime by any stretch of the imagination. But I think we have to really separate out, as socialists have done through the ages, between defense of a regime which is under attack by imperialism and defense of the people within that state against their own rulers. The two are not incompatible. Often, I think socialists make the mistake of thinking that because they have to defend Iran against Israel, therefore they have to defend the regime in toto. That's a great mistake, which I hope no one here would suggest otherwise. I mean, I've had these arguments, for instance, with Chris Williamson about this, that yes, you can support the Iranian regime against its enemies whilst at the same time supporting the people of Iran. The two are not incompatible. What will happen? We don't know the nature of the Israeli attack on Iran, although I think it's a fair bet that it's coming. And we don't know the nature of the Iranian response. I suspect that Iran has its nuclear facilities buried so deep in the mountains that Israel will not, even with its bunker buster bombs, be able to attack it. Whether it goes for the oil fields is an open question, given that that will be an open license for Iran to attack other oil facilities. These questions remain yet to be determined, and I'm in no position to speculate, and it would be idle to do so. As regards the Israeli demonstrations, well, it's very clear from the start, and that Smotrich was quite clear, that we should not bother too much about the Israeli hostages. And Netanyahu is clearly of the same opinion, that the hostages must not be allowed to interfere with the war effort, which is why, I mean, the hostages who've come out have said that our main fear was of being killed by the Israeli bombs. Israel is a state which, I mean, although it's not a fascist state, it has many aspects of fascism. And one aspect of fascism is that the individual counts for nothing and the state counts for everything. And that is summed up really in the Hannibal Directive, which was originally supposed to be implemented only for military captives, namely, if someone is taken captive, it's better to kill them than to allow them to be swapped at a later stage for Palestinian prisoners. On the 7th of October, from midday onwards, there was a mass Hannibal directive aimed at all Israeli hostages, including the civilians. We know for an absolute fact, I mean, that the residents of Kibbutz Birim were killed by Israeli tank shells. I think we also know, just looking at the kind of mass graveyards for cars, which were totally burnt out, that Israel did not have, that Hamas rather, did not have the weapons, they were only carrying light weapons, to do that. They were destroyed by Hellfire missiles and other munitions in the Apache helicopters. They literally emptied literally fired every single bullet and then went back to replenish themselves. So I would say with some confidence that the majority of the civilians who died on October the 7th were killed by Israel. I'm not saying Hamas didn't kill some, especially at the Supernova Festival, but Israel, of course, has no interest in examining these things because it knows what the answer would be. I mean, it's been quite explicit, which is why when we hear about all the rape narratives and all the atrocities and all the rest of it, that there is no forensic evidence. On the contrary, they buried the bodies as soon as they could. They did not want to examine this because it would interfere with their narrative. And so one treats with a pinch of salt the idea that Hamas engaged in a mass rape orgy. I mean, I'm not saying no one was raped. Rape happens in war, but compared to the behavior of the Israeli military, including the rape of prisoners in custody, it is marginal and tiny by comparison. If Israel does attack Iran in a way that triggers a regional war, the beginnings of it, then we have thousands in Iraq who are militias, the Iraqi Hezbollah and others, who may need to go through Jordan if they're going to join Hezbollah. I mean, it opens up a number of possibilities because the Jordanian regime is not a strong regime. And it, again, lacks a popular base. So America will be weighing all of these considerations very carefully when it discusses with Israel what its response will be. I just wanted to comment on something Yassamine said when she talked about the role of martyrdom in the Shiite religious philosophy or ideology. I don't doubt that the example of Imam Hussein and other martyrs is very important, but I would just say this, that the role of martyrdom is also common to many other national liberation struggles. For example, the Irish Republican struggle, which has a whole list of people who were martyred in the fight for liberation. So it's not just a religious concept. And I think it's important for people to understand that. Steve, in his invitation for me to speak to you, asked a series of questions, and I'm going to try and answer them now. The first one was, is the invasion of Lebanon a turning point in the Gaza war? If so, where does this lead? Well, this is a $64,000 question. I suspect it is a turning point in the Gaza war. Where will it lead? I think that depends entirely on the outcome and whether Israel gets bogged down in the Lebanese swamp. If it does, I think it could have major repercussions inside Israel itself. Is a war with Iran the inevitable next step? It's not inevitable, but it's certainly a possibility. The third question was Netanyahu's war in Gaza with the absence of a ceasefire, hostages, etc. is unpopular amongst a section of Israeli society, but the invasion of Lebanon is very popular. 87% support. Has Netanyahu turned his unpopularity into a winning position by engaging in a wider Middle East war? Well, I've really dealt with that. It may be popular initially, especially with the assassination of Nasrallah and the pager attacks. But my own view is that unless Israel is able to score a decisive victory, then it will rapidly become unpopular. And so that's my answer to that. 4, Israel is seen on the left as a terror state engaged in a genocidal war in Gaza, imposing apartheid on the Palestinians with Zionist fascists in the government. Will Israel's policy of permanent war turn Israel into a fascist state? My answer to that is no. This is a popular misconception on the left. Fascism is a particular beast. It's a beast which, for example, its main aim is the destruction and atomization of the organizations of the working class, as we saw in Nazi Germany when the unions were banned 1 month after Hitler came to power. That is not the case in Israel. Histadrut is powerful. It used to own, it was the second largest employer in Israel after the state itself. It's now been forced to disgorge what it owns because most of its enterprises were going bankrupt. But Histadrut still, in fact, today it's more of a union than it ever was. There's no suggestion that the Israeli state is going to turn on Histadrut or indeed the Israeli Jewish working class. I think what is true is that Israeli settler colonialism is now moving towards the solution that you saw in Australia and America, which is extermination. And that is the lesson that's also learned from Nazi Germany, which, it took lessons from the Holocaust, which were the opposite of ones that socialists would draw. There is a belief on the left that the ultimate evil is fascism, but that's not true. Well, it may be for us in Europe, but if you're a Native American in the United States, then it wasn't fascism you were facing up to, it was settler colonialism. And settler colonialism is every bit as bloody, if not more so, than fascism. So I don't think we should misuse the label of fascism. Israel is not a fascist society. There isn't a corporate sector linking trade unions and employers and so on. To a great extent, amongst the Israeli Jewish population, you have a resemblance of normal bourgeois Western society. But of course, its attitude to the Palestinians, including Israeli Palestinians, is very different because it is a settler colonial society. And so was German fascism, incidentally. Lebensraum, the expansion, the living space, which arose out of the Hossbach Protocol in 1937, where Hitler said, we cannot breathe, we need to expand into Eastern Europe. It is true of Israel as well. And don't forget that the original goal of the Zionists was the creation or the reclaiming of Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel. And for those who are biblical scholars amongst us, you will know that the biblical land of Israel goes from the Litani River in Lebanon down to the Brook of the Nile in Egypt and then across to the Euphrates in Iraq. Now, I'm not saying that Israel is about to engage in that because, like Germany, it didn't have enough settlers. That was what held Nazi Germany back. It couldn't find enough Germans to settle these places. Israel, likewise, hasn't yet mastered the tactic of creating a much larger Jewish population. But certainly the ideology is there for expansion. All of this lacking is the means. My own view is it won't be able to achieve that. And the final question from Steve is, we have identified the mass Palestine solidarity movement in England with a democratic part of civil society. How can the movement respond to the Lebanon war and the widening of the crisis? Well, I think it has to up its game, to be quite honest. And it also, I think, has to consider engaging in mass civil disobedience. I mean, there have been the growth of Palestine direct action groups like Palestine Action, of which I am a supporter, but it's been confined, if you like, to tame marches strolling through London on a Saturday, really posing a threat to no one, although they've attracted the ire of Suella Braverman, the Tory right, and indeed the police. They haven't, if you like, changed the balance of power. So there is a real need for a mass Palestine solidarity movement, the Lebanese solidarity movement, which will actually pose a challenge to the British state in the way that hasn't been done. And that also includes winning over workers in this country to refuse to supply arms to Israel. I mean, I think that is absolutely crucial. So I'll leave it there. I've gone on for far too long, I know, but by all means, fire away.
Thank you very much, Tony. A very, very clear exposition of the situation, I think. We're going now to our final speaker, which is Steve Freeman, who is representing, of course, our Republican Labour Education Forum. So over to you, Steve.
I was thinking about events today on October the 7th, and I saw, and all these things were reported today, 3 things that were reported. One was that in Israel, there were 2 events to commemorate those who died or were taken hostage, as it were, in the prison breakout that Hamas led on October the 7th. So hundreds of people attended a gathering in Hostage Square, it's called, in Tel Aviv. Basically survivors and hostage families demonstrated outside Netanyahu's house calling for a ceasefire and a hostage deal. Then there was a different memorial attended by the president. I don't know if this one possibly took place at Kibbutz Be'eri near the Nova Festival, I think was reported. And then it was reported the official event had no live audience because it was going to be pre-recorded to make sure there was going to be no opportunity for protest by angry Israelis. And then there was an alternative event in a park in Tel Aviv with a large, I don't know what the turnout has been like, but it was expected to have a large turnout. And it was called a People's Memorial with no government officials allowed to be present because the crowd was furious with the Netanyahu government, his policy of, in effect, permanent war, a war without end. Because, of course, Israel is a deeply divided society, and these divisions have been opened up between, obviously, the left and right Zionists, if you like, as we mentioned, and also that part of the Arab Israelis who are not simply second-class citizens and discriminated against, but they're probably now the enemy within, in the way things have gone. And then on Radio 4 this morning, you may have heard this, a report by Matthew Hollingworth of the World Food Programme about starvation in Gaza. And he said over the last couple of months, the situation in Gaza has deteriorated significantly. And if we've been talking, the world's been getting upset about genocide. Well, genocide takes many different forms, not just bombs and shooting and all the rest of it. Only a small amount of food is coming into Gaza, he said now. The crossings are closed, they're not functioning. Remember all the thing when the Americans were going to build a jettison and do this and the next thing, whatever he's talking about it, it's just completely disappeared. And it said that only 4% of the necessary food for October had actually come in. And so now he said the situation is seriously bad, as we know. And then, of course, we know in Lebanon, it's reported that 2,000 people were killed in the last 2 weeks and 10,000 people have been wounded in Lebanon. And I noticed that Benny Gantz was in New York or was reported in the New York Times to say that Israel is now waiting for its chance to build a Western alliance to confront Iran, a once-in-a-generation chance to damage the regime in Tehran. So that's kind of like where they're going. Now, there's no military solution and there's no imperialist solution to this problem. There has to be a democratic solution. That's what we in the Republican Labour Education Forum have been talking about and thinking about during the last year. And we've talked because as we talked about working class republicanism, that is to say republicanism, which is about nation and class and the interconnection between them and the struggle for a democratic secular republic. Whether we're talking about England or the UK or Israel or Palestine or Lebanon or Iraq, we're talking about people power and in working class republicanism, which gives the primacy to the working class as the universal class across the world. And of course, we've taken a stand on recognizing two nations in the territory from the river to the sea. And we've been arguing for one state, a democratic, secular federal republic, one state of two nations, which we believe is the most democratic demand that is being put forward by anybody. And I would, at this point, deviate to say that Tony is organising, the Socialist Labour Network is organising a meeting tomorrow on the topic of the one-state solution. So I would recommend that comrades attend that. And, you know, we're one version of it. We're a version of a one-state solution. And we have to be raising these things. They don't seem to be immediately there, but we have to be raising a vision that there's something other than military or imperialist solution to this terrible, terrible human tragedy. Now, let me just briefly keep my eye on Carol, just stop me in about a few minutes, but let me just turn to the invasion of Lebanon and make a comment on a couple of these questions, which have been well covered by Yassamine and Tony as well. So I'm going to try to go over all that. But in 1916, Lenin had a slogan called, that he said, turn the imperialist war into a civil war. And what he meant by that was that in the terrible slaughter during the First World War in the trenches in the Somme and in Eastern Europe where the Russian troops were battling with Kaiser's German army, the answer was to turn on your own officers, turn on your own ruling class and not simply be used to kill working class people on the other army. And the same demand was relevant for Germany, France, Britain. Of course, by civil war, Lenin meant the democratic revolution, creating a republic, which of course is it didn't seem feasible in 1916, but soon became feasible all of a sudden in early 1917 when the Russian Revolution broke out. Now, I was thinking about this. Well, Benjamin Netanyahu has taken Lenin's slogan and tried to turn it upside down. He's set out to turn this civil war, because in a way it is, we could call it a civil war that's taking place between Israelis and Palestinians across the West Bank and Gaza, inside the borders. And the government is turning this civil war into an imperialist war by taking the fight to Iran. And it's a kind of logical extension of turning into something completely reactionary, turning into a regional or Middle Eastern power struggle. And it's dangerous, by the way, not just because of the people that will be killed, but, and it's not just the price of oil. The danger of this process is you open up the possibility, and they must be thinking about this, and an attack on the Iranian regime could open up the possibility of revolution in Iran or revolution in Iraq. So it's danger of opening up not just war, but also revolutionary consequences. And that's what they're going to be thinking about. What are they doing? You know, that this imperialist war might turn into something a more wider popular people's revolution against those regimes. And it's been mentioned. It says, if the war with Iran is inevitable, I think it's where will it lead? I don't know where it's going to lead because we can't predict the future. I think Tony answered the point about was Netanyahu's war in the yes, Netanyahu has made himself popular by making this turn, but of course it's also winding up the opposition, I think, in Israel to that. The question of will this Zionist policy of permanent war turn Israel into a fascist state? Now, I think we've all agreed that Israel is not a fascist state. Everybody's said that. But I think the question, and I was interested to hear what Tony said about the role of the working class in all this. But And I also agree that we don't use the word fascist like just, you know, it's got to be scientific. It's got to be based on a proper analysis. We don't just bandy terms around just because we don't like something. We've got to use it in a very correct way. But I wonder whether we might think of whether Israel is becoming fascist. And I say that not now, but it could become as a result of this war, because this war is going to take Israeli society into a very different, not just a quantitative, possibly a qualitative direction, because it's going to strengthen the military, it's going to strengthen Netanyahu, and it's going to say, well, can we have elections in Israel? Can we have civil rights, civil liberties in a war situation? So I can see a danger, given the balance of forces in Israel, that this could push Israel much further in a fascist direction than it currently is, because of course, as has already been emphasized, there are fascists in Netanyahu's far-right government. Now, moving on from that point of discussion, the last point, I think, was about the mass demonstrations in England. And I noticed that I listened to what Starmer was saying in a talk that he gave in, I think it was the Sunday Times, an article that was written in the Sunday Times. I mean, it's absolutely full of bias, completely. He talks about the murder. He talks about the murder of Jewish people. Jews were murdered, not killed, but Gazans, it turns out, get killed and not murdered. I mean, just if you just see the way that goes, and the Gazans, no Gazans appear to have suffered any rape, torture, brutality beyond mentioning that the fact that there's been this terrible situation that appears like the way he says the national anthem. But what Starmer does do is he talks about the flames of this deadly conflict now threaten to consume the region, and the sparks light touch papers in our own communities here at home, because he says Israelis and the Middle East, he doesn't mention Palestine, are not just inseparable from our nation's history, they have a deep relationship. Though Starmer seems to be worried about the consequences in this country of a further escalation of this war in the Middle East. He says millions have family ties with the region, we know that, but he poses it, right? He says, during difficult times, our difference and diversity should bind us together more strongly and not drive us apart. But he says there are some who would use the conflict to stoke conflict here. And then he speaks about we've watched the vile hatred against Jews and Muslims rise in our communities. So he's posing the question, right? He's posing the question of the threat of some sort of racial conflict in England as a result of this. And I think we on the left have to reframe that argument, because this is not about Jews, in this sense, it's not about Jews and Palestinians. It's about the policies of the British state, as Tony mentioned, or the British Crown, as we would call it, and how those policies are impacting on civil society. We see a mass movement on the streets, and Tony says quite rightly, we need to up our game. But how do we up our game if we don't challenge the way that our state and constitution and system of government is operating? So I think that we, the left, and this movement, which is, I see it as a kind of civic movement, a civic Republican movement, because it's people of all different races, religions, backgrounds, all kinds coming onto the streets, protesting for democracy and against this terrible genocide in Gaza. And I think that's a very significant break in our body politic, if you like. And I think that we have to think very, very carefully about how we, what Tony says, raise our game. What political demands do we put? What democratic demands do we put? And what do we say, not just about what's going on over there, but what's actually happening in this country? And I think we have to link them together. So I do see what's happening in that movement. It's not consciously a Republican movement, but I see it as a civic and democratic movement that ought to become, should become, a movement for democratic republicanism in this country and actually against the politics of the crown and all of its imperialist policies and all of its link with America. So I think I don't think it's just a matter of upping your game in terms of doing more direct action. I think we've got to up our game politically. The left has to up its game politically. That's what I would say. But I agree with what Tony said. Upping the game. Yeah, no, I don't want to talk any longer than that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Steve. If anybody else would like to ask a question or make a contribution, you are invited now. So please raise your electronic hands and I'll bring you in order. So at the moment I can't see. Oh, John, right. John has raised his hand. John, can you put your video on, please, so that we can see you? John Tumman.
I think that we do need to reassess, really, and I do see some signs of this happening anyway. Oh, I can't see me now. Right. I do see some signs of this happening anyway, that people are beginning to. I mean, for instance, up here in Greater Manchester, things have gone very local. So you've got pro-Palestinian activities in all the different parts of the city of Manchester now, and the surrounding boroughs of Manchester within Greater Manchester, as well as the kind of fairly regular Saturday demonstrations. And those demonstrations themselves are stopping in important symbolic places and staying there for quite a while. I do think we need to consider another dimension which is happening, and which to my mind it is very connected with the whole issue of is there going to be any fascism anywhere? And I say no, because states, certainly in the Western world as well as in the Eastern world, have developed very, very strong internally coercive means of repression. And they are now winding those up. They're winding them up ideologically through tampering with the laws, lowering the threshold for terrorism offences. They're winding it up in terms of attacks on the media, arresting people like Tony, like Sarah Wilkinson, like Julian Assange, and also in the case of the IDF, of course, killing hundreds of journalists. So there is an attack on investigative journalism, and I sent people around this morning the latest thing from Caitlin Johnson, the American activist who has been taken down by Meta, by Facebook. This is now a very, very common thing. It was common months ago, but now it has suddenly become much more common. People whose at Facebook's I check aren't active anymore, and the last message is they've taken my Facebook page down. And as I think I said, in various African and some other countries, rulers have actually been taking down the entire internet when they feel under particular threat in what they regard as an existential crisis for their continued rule. So that is happening as well. That is extreme repression. More and more people are being lifted off the streets during demonstrations. So we have to bear that in mind when we're talking about what we do. I'm not saying it has any contra implications to doing more and doing different things, but we just have to bear it in mind. That's all I'm saying. Apart from that, I thought we had two excellent contributions tonight. Really, really good. And Steve added some things at the end, which were also good. I haven't much to say in response to those, but I just wanted to raise this point.
Thank you very much indeed, John. I couldn't agree with you more. I have Mike Hope with his hand up. Mike?
Thanks so much, Yassamine and Tony and Steve. There's a great deal there. The question which is sort of hanging around, and I think, Tony, you were sort of more or less answering it, but it's still a little unclear. The question as to what is Netanyahu's strategy? What is the Israeli government strategy? Because there's a lot of talk about engaging in forever wars. And for Netanyahu, that does put off the day when he'll have to face his own reckoning, which was about to have happened before October the 7th, which was him being possibly banged up on corruption charges. So a lot of people, and including a heck of a lot of people on the left, are saying, well, you know, this is engaging in a forever war. And I think your formulation, Steve, of reversing Lenin's dictum is a sort of almost another way of saying that. But the other interpretation, which is the one I would veer towards more, is that actually it is about creating, under the stimulus of the far right in government, creating the greater Israel. It may be, as Tony says, that you know, they're not going to be sufficient settlers to populate the greater Israel, though they've done a pretty good, as in bad, job with regard to the West Bank. And there is, you know, there's been a lot of talk about what they're going to do in Gaza. And yeah, at the very least, some settler outposts in southern Lebanon and a sort of what they would call a demilitarized zone, what we would call an extremely militarized zone, seems to be, I think, where Netanyahu and Israel are heading with this. But I'd be interested to hear the views of all of you. On upping our game, yes, of course, we absolutely must. I think Starmer becomes ever more ridiculous. I mean, if he wasn't so full of vitriol towards the real victims of this, in other words, Palestinians, it would be laughable. He is pretty much today sort of represented the ridiculous speech he made after October the 7th, where he completely ignores, he sees no connection at all between supposed rape on one side and which has, you know, where there is sparse evidence and, you know, numbers killed, where again, as Tony says, there's now plenty of evidence that quite a few were killed by Israeli fire, with the absolute evidence of rape and torture and systematic targeting of children, of doctors and clinicians of all types, of schools, of universities, of hospitals. And Starmer makes himself ridiculous by ignoring those things. It's like the elephant in the room gets bigger and bigger, and his inability to even address it in a very basic form. I think we have to, on the left, we have to develop new forms of absolute mockery and derision for the politics behind that within the Labour Party and their allies. And in the Labour movement, well, as Tony knows, because he and I are both in Unite, one of the biggest stumbling blocks is Unite the Union and Sharon Graham. And, you know, there we could actually develop means of blockading and preventing the shipment of arms and other items, other necessary war items for Israel. It could be done. We need to urgently develop a dialogue with workers in the munitions industries and in sort of port logistics and sort of air freight logistics in order for this to happen. It is, that has to be one of the next steps. There are, in addition to Palestine Action, there have been other people taking pretty direct action though already. I'm thinking of Youth Demand, who've done some very audacious things. They're a sort of spin-off of Extinction Rebellion and Just Stop Oil. But they've really shown a lot of courage in what they have done. And we need to see, I think, more of that. Maybe some of ourselves, perhaps not so much Youth Demand, but just demand.
Thanks very much, Mike. Totally agree with what you've said as well. Tony, do you want to come back to any of those comments or questions?
I agree with most of the contributions. I mean, it's clearly very difficult to frame a response that goes beyond what has already been done without, if you like, challenging the forces of the state themselves, who are part and parcel of the implementation of the genocide. Because there's no doubt the British Armed Forces have been active in the genocide. We don't know all the details, but we have a good idea as to what has been happening. And I agree with Mike. I mean, the position of the Unite and its leadership has been absolutely disgraceful. And not just Unite, really, the TUC and the major unions, Unison, GMB, have also been pretty bad, to say the least. And this is a reflection of the kind of economism, depoliticization of British trade unionism in itself. The fact that trade unions today are so much weaker than they were 40 years ago. They have half the membership. Political strikes no longer occur. Solidarity with other workers is, all of this has gone by the board, and therefore taking up an international issue and seeing the connections between what happens here and what happens overseas is not on the horizons of most functionaries. I mean, most officials and unions, of course, are more concerned with keeping down the membership than defending their interests. And we have to accept, or not accept, really, the corrupt and sweetheart deals that our union leaders do, the complete lack of any political horizon. But it also relates to the left as a whole. I mean, if I got started, I'd probably never stop about the failures of the left, but they have really learnt very, very little over time. And we see many of the left sects whose only interest is in building themselves, regardless of what happens to the movement. And I include the SWP as a prime example of that. So, I mean, these groups do not make any attempt to go beyond the ritual demonstrations in the central London. That is absolutely true of Stop the War. There's no attempt to occupy government offices and buildings and parliament and so on. I mean, they could take a leaf out of some of the climate action groups in terms of disruption of civil society. I'm not saying I necessarily agree with blocking motorways and so on, but there are certainly things they could do in terms of jamming up the centre of London, for example, and possibly occupying factories. I mean, Palestine Action has borne the brunt of the direct action against Israeli arms factories, Elbit in particular, and a number of people are now in prison for that, on remand or serving sentences. So, I mean, a lot of people have paid a heavy price, and I'm fearful, certainly in terms of Palestine Action, that the leadership of it is going to pay a very heavy price when the state eventually manages to convict them, because we have an absurd situation that people like Richard Barnard is being charged with the same offence over and over again. If the state can't win once, it tries again. if at first you don't succeed and all that. So I mean, I just think we have to look at the state of our own movement, if you like, in this country. But we also have to enlighten people that, you know, I mean, if what the British military does abroad, it can do at home as well. The two aren't separated at all, and they go hand in hand with the obscene distribution of wealth in this country and the obscene repression that we're seeing in Palestine. So, I mean, that's my main, if you like, response to what has been a good discussion.
Thank you very much, Tony. I've got Bob. Bob, I'm going to bring you in now.
Okay, thank you, Carol. Yeah, and thank you to all the speakers. I think it's been absolutely fabulous. But I suppose following on from what Tony was saying a little bit there, and I know Steve's raised this issue in the past, and John Tumman has raised it as well. You know, coming out the mass movement around Palestine, we need to build a new party. We need a Republican Socialist Party, not like the various initiatives around Corbyn, which I think is kind of a kind of weak social democracy. We need a democratic Republican Socialist Party, and I know that task seems impossible at the moment in many ways, but also there is a lot of dry tinder around. There are a lot of people who would support such an organization. So I think we really, and I know there are various discussions going on around it, but we do need to seriously address that. You know what, you know, Tony mentioned the failures of various left groups like the SWP. You know, because they're not Democrats, they're not Republicans, and frankly, they're not serious. They're not serious about building organization. So that's what we need to do. Even if there's only half a dozen of us, we need to start talking to comrades, talking to friends, talking to neighbours, talking to people in the bus stop about the need for organization. You know, an organized minority will always rule a disorganized majority, and that's the main task. You know, it's the height of politics is organising our class effectively, you know, and I think that's what we need to do. And at one level, this is all very mundane and banal and obvious, but it is what we need to do kind of every day, is to think about how can we get better organised. And nobody, as far as I know yet, has come up with a better form than a socialist, a democratic socialist party. If the people do come up with a better form, you know, I'd be delighted to hear about it. But I think that's where we're at. It's a difficult place. You know, the world's going to hell in a handcart, but nevertheless, the tasks remain the same. You know, I live up in Scotland. We're trying to organise up here. I know people, comrades in England and Wales and Ireland and the rest of the world are doing it. So let's keep talking to each other. Let's strengthen our links and let's spread the word. You know, that's all we can do, really. And if we all do our best, then we'll get there. I believe that.
Thanks very much, Bob. Absolutely agree. I mean, if you think about what the unions could do with the situation in Israel, they could bring the whole thing to a standstill. You know, the arms, if the arms industry unions stopped producing and stopped shipping to Israel, the power that people have when they get together and decide to take action is immense. Anyway, thanks very much, Bob, and thanks to everybody else. I think I'm going to bring Steve back in for a final concluding.
I'll just make a couple of points in response to what comrades have said. The point about the idea, this slogan, from a civil war to an imperialist war, or from an imperialist war to a civil war, is that it is a turning point, and it's a qualitative. It's not just like from Hamas to Hezbollah, like one lot have got more weapons. It's not about quantity, having more weapons or more rockets. It's a qualitative change in the nature of what's going on. It's a turning point, a qualitative turning point in what's taking place. And that leads back to this question that Tony raised, and I agree with, of upping our game. that if this is a turning point in the Middle East, the things that if it's going to turn into like a more wider imperialist war and possibly democratic revolution in response to that, we have to up our game. And I don't mean by upping our game doing more things that we're already doing. Okay, it could be that as well, like a more direct action that Tony said. I think we've got to have a better program. We've got to have a program to unite the movement more powerfully. And my argument was that while Starmer's was presenting this as something like Jews versus Muslims, there's like some sort of race thing going on, we have to present it as the loyalists, those who are loyal to the crown and its policy, and civic republicanism that's coming out in protest against it. And we know the loyalists. When we went on the demo, we saw the Israeli flags and the Union Jack standing in one corner with, 50 people, 100 people there protesting at the side of the demonstration. But I mean, they're a tiny little group when you think the whole state has got Israeli flags and Union Jacks to wave around. But civic republicanism, which is what I see this movement, is kind of like a republic movement. It's not politically that, is it? It hasn't turned really against the crown, the state. It's not set itself a program in that direction. So I think we have to have a serious discussion about where does this movement go to raise its game to a higher political level and to break with the crown. Which all we're really doing actually is asking for the crown to behave better, to not give them arms and all the rest of it. I think that's not going to happen, is it? We know that's not going to happen. It has to be a more radical thing for that to happen. So I think upping our game, direct action, all the rest of it, and I agree with that, but I think we've got to up our game politically. And including, by the way, I'll just end on this point, including getting the movement to reject the two-state solution, which appears to be the sort of go-to do-nothing position that the trade union movement does, which is why I go back to the thing that Tony said. There has to be much more discussion about the one-state argument. And I hope people will go to Tony's meeting tomorrow or the SLN meeting tomorrow.
Absolutely, Steve. I've got one more hand up. Malcolm, I'm just going to bring Malcolm in.
I think that the British population, I don't know what in other countries, I think about less than 6 or 8% belong to a political party of any sort. At the general election, about 60% or 70% of people vote. Local elections, it's far lower than that. The truth is that in any way, who are active, aware, or could really care less is a huge percentage of the population. So when people talk about any political party doing anything, they're only talking to a very small percentage of the population. And I don't know how you motivate most people in the population to be aware of the fact that politics is important to their lives, because I think most people just think it's all hopeless and doesn't matter and they can't do anything or anything. So I don't know how you politicize a population so that all this action that people are talking about, of which I agree with almost everything that's been said, how you get the majority of the population to be in favor of it rather than just a small percentage of activists who, if they start doing direct action, appear to annoy a large number of people. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Malcolm. Actually, that is a very relevant question. And gosh, okay, we've got now more hands up. So, okay, we've gone on an awful long time. So if I can ask people from now on to be really, really brief, please. So Bob.
Just responding to what Malcolm was saying about how do we motivate people, I think that relates to what Steve said. We need to develop a program, what I would call an immediate program, that meets the needs of the people. And people are telling us what they need. They need housing, they need health, they need education, they need nutritional food, they need free speech. So I think we can develop a program fairly quickly, and go around the doors, or hand it out to meetings, or Palestinian marches, things like that. I think get the program together and then get out and popularize it. I think that's what we do. It's
Absolutely, Bob. Yeah, good. Mike, just bringing Mike in now.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that and motivation. I mean, Malcolm, if you're out on demonstrations around Palestine, both the mass ones in London, and I've been involved in some local ones here in Suffolk, you know, we're outside lobbying Barclays Bank every week. Sure, there are some hostile people, but there are a heck of a lot of people who stop and listen and people who say that they will change their account. When we're holding vigils at a place where lots of traffic passes by and asking for, we get a heck of a lot. There is a groundswell. Of course, people aren't clear exactly what they're going to do with that. And the danger with the Starmer promises is that it will demoralize, and the right will certainly then, the far right will certainly then try and mobilize people. But what I was also going to say in relation to calling for a single democratic secular state, as opposed to the two-state solution. This Friday, I'm seeing I'm in Suffolk, my local Green MP, the co-leader of the Greens, Adrian Ramsey, and I'm going to tackle him on exactly that, because the Greens, for all their apparent support for Palestine, still talks. Ramsey repeated it on BBC Question Time Radio 4 on Friday. They still support a two-state solution. We really have to, you know, loudly explain why that is just, well, A, it's never going to happen, and B, it just repeats the kind of apartheid relationship that it already is there. There is no way that any justice can come out of it. So yeah, I mean, just on that level, there are things that we can do and that we must do. But I mean, you know, don't underestimate the groundswell of potential support that there is.
Thanks very much, Mike. Good. That's quite an encouraging answer. I mean, that's what we're all about. The Republican Labour Education Forum is all about education and trying to get these ideas out to people and to make people realise that politics is life. I'm going to bring Steve in. Thanks very much, Mike. I'm going to bring Steve back in.
I mean, the only thing I'd really want to say right now, I think we've had a long meeting. We've had some great contributions to it from the other speakers and from the contributions from the floor as well, to say that we've sort of moved away slightly into talking about what might be called domestic politics rather than Middle Eastern politics. And I think the trick here is how we can connect both of them together and not leave them in separate boxes. So I think that discussion towards the end, where we're starting to think about what is the politics happening in this country, but how can we connect this so that we don't have this purely, as it were, single issue about Palestine, which is kind of over there when we do that, and then there's another politics over there. That's our task, is to connect these things together in a more general struggle. And I think the thing that I'll end on this point, the thing that connects them together is all those questions of democracy, our failing democracy, the power of the crown to direct our foreign policy in alliance with America. We have to do something about that and not just take that as a given. And then that's what we have to link up. We have to link up this civic movement, this civic Republican Democratic movement, to a bigger picture of changing the way that politics is structured here as well, and not just leave it as a single issue campaign where we march, once a month, and that's about as far as we go with it. Because I think now with this, what I did on this point, I think we're on a qualitative change in what's happening, and that's going to leave us trailing in the wake of these events if we don't now start to think about how do we change the movement in a more, we up our game, I think is the phrase for it. We need to talk about that more. I'll finish there.
That's a good phrase to have come out of this meeting. We need to up our game.
The place that I know there is a discussion that's already started on all the issues, problems with and the kind of lessons from the past with in relation to a new party is happening in connection with the left lane. And I've been part of the very first discussion on that, which was a really interesting meeting, by the way, really interesting. A lot of people who've thought about this kind of stuff and have experience of, for instance, the Scottish Socialist Party, Socialist Alliance, and lots of things, and have learned things from that. And the next stage in that is to invite wider groups of people along to those discussions. So I have emailed people to this effect, but I do send out a lot of emails. Could people please contact me if they want to be part of that? Because that is one way forward from one aspect. Bob's given me a thumbs up.
Thanks very much, John.
And Peter.
Thank you very much, John. Right, I think we've had an immensely interesting and powerful meeting. The three speakers were excellent, and the contributions and questions have also been absolutely outstanding. So I just want to say thank you very much to everyone who's attended this meeting tonight, and let's make sure that we do up our game. And so enjoy the rest of your evening, and goodbye.